You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hi, Valerie. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, and thank you for making time to talk to us today.
Hi, Rachel. It's nice to see you, and my pleasure.
Yay!
I wouldn't miss it.
Many of our listeners know you, whether that's from teaching on yoga medicine online or from the Yoga Medicine 200 Hour or from the Yoga Medicine mental health and wellness training, but maybe they don't all know that you're a scientist and a professor as well. So maybe we start the conversation by talking about what initially got you interested in science and psychology.
Sure. Well, I'm trying to figure out how far to go back. I'll try
back in the distant recesses of the past.
Back in the day. So I feel like I had always had an interest in psychology. What put me into the area of kind of biology, biological psychology, was when my sister had a child with Down syndrome. And I learned about what the causes of Down syndrome are, which is a chromosomal abnormality. And so I became very interested in just the biological basis of behavior and how our underlying biology can manifest in a lot of like individual differences across the population. So if you were to look at a sample of individuals with Down syndrome, they all don't look the same or act the same. There's a constellation of outcomes that are tied to this one kind of chromosomal abnormality. And that really interested me. So I started to look into programs that focused on kind of biological psychology, neuroscience, and then stumbled into the area of behavioral genetics. Honestly, it was a bit of a stumbling. I went to visit a school really to look at the behavioral neuroscience program, and I didn't have a good experience with that interview and walked out of the hallway and I saw this sign for behavioral genetics and I thought, I'm going to go chat with somebody in that program. And it just was a really great fit. And so I was really fortunate to get accepted into that program. And that started the course of my career and trying to understand the genetic basis of behavior. And one of the biggest findings, I think, that people don't understand when we talk about the genetics of behavior, one of the biggest findings that has come out of our field is the importance of the environment, that it's not just biology, but that the environment and the context in which we all grow up and live and survive and thrive plays such a big role in shaping who we are. So I think that's kind of the abbreviated version of how I got into psychology and really more focused on the biology of psychology. I knew I didn't want to be a clinical psychologist. I knew that would not be a good fit for my constitution, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
I feel like I have so much respect for. I would take it home. I have so much respect for individuals that can do that, and they do it so well. And I just feel like I would take it home, and it would be really hard for me to leave work at work.
Yeah, no, I totally get that 100%. We're about the same age, and I feel like your career has paralleled a really interesting time in science, because I remember when I was just out of university and starting to make my way out into the world, genetics was everything because they were working on the Human Genome Project. And we had this, even in, I know nothing about science, but even in the back of my mind, I was thinking, by the time I'm old, everything is going to be different. Medicine is going to be all down to our genetics. There are going to be designer babies, all of this stuff. And it really didn't come to pass. As you said, they figured out that there were plenty of other things, including environment, that had at least as large an impact on us as our genes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, so much has a genetic influence, but very few things are like 100% genetic.
So when did you first come across the concept of epigenetics, or was that something that was talked about in science world or science circles and just didn't come into mass market until recently?
That's a great question. I think I may have started really thinking more deeply about it after I was finished with my training and had started a faculty position at Brown University. And some of the work that I was conducting at the time, the research that I'm still conducting, but to give you some context, I'm very interested in the prenatal environment.
Just pause for a second.
The prenatal environment. Sure.
Yeah, sorry, pause. You cut out a bit there. And so let's just start answering that question again, which was, when did you first come across epigenetics? And
I was like, what was the question?
Yeah, I know. It was ages ago.
It felt like ages ago. Okay. Tell me when you're ready. Anytime?
Start. Go for it.
Okay. I think I got focused in on epigenetics, or kind of more aware of epigenetics as a concept, as something to think about. Early in my faculty career, I had finished my kind of formal training in grad school and then as a postdoc, and then I had started this faculty position, and I was starting kind of in earnest my primary program of research, which is trying to disentangle the prenatal environmental effects from genetic effects on later offspring child behavior. And there was some literature that was coming out at the time about the role of the prenatal environment and how kind of this idea of fetal programming and the environment that the mom is exposed to. So it's really around the Dutch famine, which happened back around World War II, where mothers who were exposed to just extreme famine. And so there was not enough nutrition. And there were researchers who had studied the offspring of those pregnancies and found a host of outcomes, like cardiovascular outcomes and metabolic outcomes, that might be consistent with this idea that the prenatal environment might inform how a child thrives and survives or doesn't in once they're born. And a lot of that has to do with epigenetics. And so this idea of the environment kind of getting under the skin, if you will. So it's a way that our environment can influence our biology. So that's when I really started thinking about it in earnest. Before then, you may have heard concepts like gene by environment interaction, and where certain genetic predispositions might perform better in certain environmental conditions. And we see this a lot in the agricultural world, where you have like a specific kind of seed that's really resilient to bad conditions, and you can still get a whole field of whatever that produce is. But yet there are some genetic seeds that they need like the ideal situation, the ideal amount of sunlight, and the ideal amount of water in order to survive and thrive. So G by E, this gene by environment interaction concept, really was fostered in the agricultural world, and then started to kind of filter into human research. And so I think before epigenetics, there was this idea that there might be something about the environment that might lead some folks to thrive and survive and be super resilient. And there might be some folks who have a genetic predisposition that doesn't match that environment, or that environment doesn't quite serve them well, might serve to their detriment, I guess. And then this idea of epigenetics kind of, there is kind of palpable scientific empirical evidence to suggest that, hey, actually there is a way in which the environment gets underneath the skin to actually affect the way that our DNA and our genes are expressed.
Yeah. And I mean, we're talking about epigenetics because when it comes to yoga, which is the topic of this podcast, there's not much we can do about our genes. I can't change my own genes. I can't change my students' genes, but I can definitely help them influence their environment.
Yes.
And I think we've all made observations looking around at, say, two people who grew up in really similar circumstances and responded really differently. So I love the fact that there's an observational aspect to it that's later been examined in more detail by science. I feel like there are a lot of things that we talk about in yoga that are like that. We've seen it, we had some idea, and now we can kind of pick it apart and prove it. So let's hone in on what epigenetics is, or are, whatever is the correct singular or plural term there. You wrote an article for Yoga Digest that had a really easy to understand analogy that I loved, which was a yellow highlighter and a black marker. And that's about the extent of science that I can wrap my head around. So maybe you explain to us what epigenetics is, and feel free to use the highlighter and the black marker for people like myself. Oh, she came prepared. Holding up a yellow highlighter.
I did. I even came prepared with another like prop, because, you know, in yoga, we're all about props. But like, if you were to take like a most well-loved book or whatever, and you see all the print on the page, those letters, the print on the page that you would read, you can think of that as your DNA. It's there. It's telling you what to take in. It's kind of guiding your experience in the book. But then if I were to take a yellow highlighter and, you know, uncap it and actually highlight some of that text, I'm not changing the words in the book. I'm not changing the letters in the book, but I'm highlighting it in such a way that I'm emphasizing it. So when I go back and read it, something about, you know, I might skim the rest of it, but I might just hone in on that yellow highlighted bit. And so it's emphasizing at it. And in the word, in kind of the epigenetic world, it would mean like that gene is going to be more expressed. There's going to be more of that gene product. So in the simplest terms, our genes code for enzymes and proteins that are the foundation of every system in our body, our nervous system, which is the most relevant to behavior, but our digestive system, respiratory system, all those things.
Hormones.
And if there's a, you know, this epigenetics, you could think of it like sitting on top of the genome. And if the print in the page is the genome, your DNA, then this yellow highlighter is the epigenome, one part, you know, kind of one example of it. And it's highlighting a specific portion of the genome to express more of. Or I could take a pen or a black marker and like scratch out a phrase or a sentence, and make it harder to read, right? So if I'm looking at that book again, I see my yellow highlighted bit, but then I also see a place that I've, you know, in like a Word document, to be strike through, where I'm crossing it out. And in that part of that particular gene or part of that chromosome or the genome, then that gene is less expressed. So there's less gene product circulating, and the body knows what to do with those. Well, it's kind of trying to adapt what to do with that either increased level of gene product or decreased level of gene product.
So it's not just a simple.
So that is like in its most simplest of terms.
Yeah. So everything in our genome is not expressed all of the time. We have a huge potential pool of possible expressions, and factors that form our epigenome are determining which of those are switched on or accentuated, and which of those are switched off or de-emphasized.
Yes.
Yeah.
And epigenetics is a normally occurring thing that happens in all of us. It's part of how we develop from a fertilized egg into a child, because there are, parts of the epigenome are telling certain genes to turn on and off at certain points in development. But then there is this other aspect of epigenetics where researchers have begun to show that environmental experiences, things that we might consider both positive experiences and or negative experiences, can also create these epigenetic marks that sit on top of our DNA and can affect the way that our genes are expressed.
So what sort of factors are we talking about? You mentioned famine and that Dutch experience in World War II. So what other sorts of factors?
So things like exercise is a really cool area of epigenetics. If you're ever interested in, kind of digging around in the epigenetics world from an exercise perspective, there's been some really cool stuff, which maybe we can talk about. So exercise, diet, medications, stress, things like connection, feelings of connected and feelings of connectedness with one another. So you can see there's kind of like this array of environments that,
I mean, some of those things sound
have
quite
been
sort of
thought to be.
Some of them sound sort of objective
and
easy to measure, but others sound quite sort of soft around the edges and difficult to measure. How do you measure social connection and affection? That's really interesting.
It's hard. I think anybody who knows me well has probably heard me say things like, human research is so messy. Humans are so messy. We aren't doing research in animal models, for example. However one feels about doing animal research, that you can control the environment, right? You can control the fact that you can have a population of animals that are all controlled or exposed to the same temperature in the room and the same amount of lighting every day and this and that, same amount of time that they spend together with another animal. And humans just, it's notoriously challenging to measure certain things in humans and to do it well. And in any research, whether it's animal models or human models or anything, you're only as good as what you like. It's the outcomes and the results and the conclusions are only as good as the measurement of the data. And so measuring things like connectedness is challenging because so much of it does rely on self-report, which when you ask somebody how connected they feel, they might be completely honest with you, but they also there might be this kind of social desirability bias that comes into their response. Like they think that the interviewer wants to hear something specific, or they think that they should feel really connected. So that's how they're going to portray themselves, even if it's untrue.
Or even for me, if you asked me today, I would probably give you a different answer to the one I would have given you yesterday or the day before. Those things, they kind of come and go, don't they, with your mood?
They do come and go.
Yeah, that's interesting.
They do come and go, and they come and go with the types of environment that we're in right now, with coming out of this pandemic and what that means to our feelings of connectedness. And what does it mean to feel connected in a world when you might not be able to go visit your best friend, and things like that.
So we're talking about a range of factors, some of which we can, to some extent control. Most of us can control the amount of exercise we can get. Most of us can control some aspect of our diet, at least. Stress becomes a little bit more difficult to control. Maybe we can control our responses, but we can't determine what's happening to us in life to create those stresses. And then connection and affection, again, we might have some control over that, but life often intervenes. And I'm already starting to get a feeling for the places where I can see yoga playing a part. So let's talk about that, since we know that there are some potentially positive ways we can use our epigenome to influence our genes. What roles do you see yoga playing in that, and kind of giving us the best possible chance for mental and physical wellness?
I think that this is a great question. And as I was listening to you kind of summarize
In
the
my messy
last
little
little
way.
segment of, no, not in a messy way, I was also reminded that many of the influences that we just kind of defined as environmental, or some of which we can control more than others, many of them are also correlated or related to one another. And so it's impossible to tease apart maybe your levels of stress from your exercise or medication or nutrition or feelings of connectedness. So there's this additional layer of I don't want to say complication, but it does make it more complex, that all of these things that might influence the way in which our genes are expressed and the way in which we interact with the world are also correlated with one another, and feed off one another. So if I'm not eating very well, I might not necessarily feel stressed like I do if I've got a big deadline at work, but it's a stressor in my body nonetheless. Right?
And I know for me, when my life is really stressful, I'm usually not eating as well. I'm usually not taking time to exercise. I'm usually not feeling connected.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So these are some of the challenges. So I think coming back to your question of how do I see yoga kind of playing a part in all this, for me, like in its most simplest of terms, I think about it in like the area of resilience and managing our stress and the way in which we respond to that stress. And so there are so many different aspects of kind of yoga related modalities that can help individuals almost like cherry pick what works for them. And for some folks, that might be a more physical asana practice. For some individuals, it might be a more restorative practice or a slower paced. For some, it might be more meditation or, myofascial release. There's just so many different aspects, or mindfulness. I mean, weaving mindfulness into asana, we could go, you kind of talk all day about all the various creative ways to kind of weave aspects of stress reduction or stress management into or use yoga to affect our ability to manage and perceive stress.
That's definitely where my head went first, in creating a little bit more space between stimulus and response. We can't always control what life throws at us, but I think almost anyone who's practiced yoga for a little while will appreciate the fact that it gives them room to go, I can see these things that are happening to me, and there's space for me to decide how I want to respond. Maybe it's just taking 2 slow, deep breaths to regulate my response. Maybe it is creating a more long-term practice that actually shifts my baseline so that I'm less reactive all the time and I'm calmer all the time. Or maybe, as you said, it's a movement practice that gives that stress of a vent and an outlet. So that was the first one that I went to. I think most of us, for whatever reason, we come to yoga to begin with. If we continue practicing, it's usually because of that influence on our stress response and the way that it makes us a little more resilient to its effects. But you mentioned earlier that there was some really interesting research on the exercise side, and there is an aspect of yoga practice that is physical exercise. So maybe talk a little about that.
It's that idea of movement, right? I mean, and so there was a really interesting study. I can share it with you. We can share it
I'd love that.
kind of with the audience. It was done quite some time ago, but there's quite a bit of work that's been done in the area since then. There was a study that followed or looked at a group of athletes and had them exercise with just one of their legs. So the individuals served as their own control group. So they kind of worked one leg specifically over a period of time and repeatedly, and kept the other leg unmoving or still. And the researchers took a biopsy before the exercise intervention and after the exercise intervention. And like, they actually characterized this, like these epigenomic changes that took place in muscle tissue that are adaptable. And they're like, why we have this response and when we exercise, and with the changes that are happening at the muscular level when we exercise. And they had this control in the same person, which controls for other genetic variability, which I think is super cool. So exercise, there's a whole body of research right now and some really nice review articles. So I can share that specific kind of cool, interesting study, but I can also share some review articles that talk about the benefits of exercise on our epigenome in terms of muscle tissue and other aspects of kind of exercise physiology, of which I am no expert in at all. So it can get pretty, detailed, but there are some nice review articles out there to just talk about what happens in the body when we exercise. And I like to think that some of these things are happening when we also just choose to move our bodies, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a strenuous workout. It can be moderate movement. And I think at least I know in my own experience, that movement is medicine for me personally. If I don't move my body in some way, I don't feel as good. And so it is definitely, and again, it doesn't always have to be something strenuous. It can be just getting outside and going on a walk or stretching or, something simple. It doesn't need to be complicated, but that aspect of movement can just be really, it can be so good for our mental health, right? To get outside, but it's also there's something biological happening as well in terms of our epigenome when we exercise.
I like that because I can tell when I challenge my muscles, they get stronger and they get more capable of meeting challenges. When I challenge my cardiovascular system, I feel that it gets stronger and more capable of meeting the challenges. But I guess I didn't realize that there were also changes happening, at the programming level, not just at the level of the tissues that I can touch, but at the base, at the structural programming level. That's, I guess, obvious when you think about it, but I'd never really thought about it. I guess I just assumed it was the muscles grow stronger when you challenge it, and the muscle of the heart grows stronger when you challenge it. I didn't think about it actually influencing the programming level. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that is what kind of fascinates me about like everything about the human body and our behavior, is that there is this biological basis that exists that informs everything that we do. Everything, right? The way that our bodies kind of work kind of as a machine every day and serve us every day. And from the kind of hardwired physiology of our heart beating and our lungs expanding and contracting to take breath in and out, and the diaphragm's involvement in that, like there's this biological blueprint, if you will, that guides all of that. And I think that that's really important, at least for me personally, to understand when I'm, when we work with a group class, or when we work with clients, or whatever it might be, in the yoga setting, that there is a biological foundation there, but we have this capacity to influence our biology in palpable ways somehow. And I like, for me, that feels like comforting. I don't know, that there's this biological foundation for virtually everything we do. And when individuals feel challenged in whatever way, whether it's physically challenged or challenged with stress or anxiety, that there are aspects of our biology that inform that response, but that it's not like 100% destiny, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's come up on previous episodes of the podcast. I'm thinking particularly of aging, the conversation I had with Mark Hunter on aging, where we were both sort of saying that there are definitely some things that come up that you can't control. You know, there may be things that come your way, especially over the course of a long life, that you have no say in, but there's almost always something that you can do. And epigenetics gives us a scientific basis for that something that we can do, whether it is to mediate our stress response and just respond to exactly the same situation with a slightly different mindset, whether that is improving the quality of our nutrition or our sleep, whether that is moving our bodies in some way that doesn't necessarily have to create stronger muscles or a stronger heart, but just moves us through space, whether it's, impact on our medication. There's almost always some levers that we can pull on that remind us that we aren't completely at the will of the universe. We do have some say.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I also, I guess, want to maybe say, I don't know, that this idea of neuroplasticity, which I think kind of ties into some of the, we're kind of touching on some of these things, like our ability to adapt or change or be in control of something, right? To try to influence something. This idea of neuroplasticity sometimes gets kind of lumped in with epigenetics as well. This idea that our brains our ability to kind of reorganize itself by kind of strengthening specific neural connections and things along those lines, I think is also just a valuable way to think about how we can, affect our own outcomes, if you will.
Yeah.
This idea of like use it or lose it, or neurons that fire together, things along those lines.
We can literally change the way that we perceive the world through neuroplasticity, the way that we experience the world. But that's also happening right down to the level of our genes, that those influence go down to which genes get switched on and how much, and which genes get de-emphasized. Yeah, it's a fascinating field. And I think, like you, I kind of come at the end going, there are some things that I can't control, but there are some things that I can, and I might as well focus my energy and attention on those. And that to me really speaks to the yoga practice of diligent practice and non-attachment, of continuing to do the things that nourish and nurture you, but to some extent understanding that not all of the outcomes are in your control, but still you do the things that you can do, knowing that they'll help in some way. So we've kind of touched on quite a few different areas here outside of just epigenetics. And the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking about mental health, which I knew would come up because it's on my list of things to talk about. But I knew it would come up. And I remember we first met at a yoga medicine training. I think it was in Sedona in the Napa Valley. And I remember you were talking then.
That was the first time we met.
I'm pretty sure. And you were talking then about the importance of mental health and how wonderful it would be if yoga medicine had a mental health training. And then, of course, you went on to create one along with Diane Malaspina and Tiffany to educate our teachers. And I think if anything over the past couple of years has changed, it's been our understanding of the importance of our mental health. It's been a real challenge for a lot of people who weren't even, in any physical danger. The mental health side of things has been huge. So let's talk for a moment about the mental health training. Why is that, do you think, such an important area for yoga teachers to be interested in and educated in?
Well, maybe it's just because of my background, but I feel like it's so much of who we are as human beings. We've got this physical anatomy, obviously, which yoga medicine is very focused on, and rightly so. And there are individual differences in our anatomy that we receive training in to help work with with students, whether it's in an individual setting or in a group setting. And so the idea of also providing teachers with some tools to understand and support their communities that they are currently teaching in from a mental health perspective, for me just felt like a no-brainer, if you will. And thankfully, Tiffany was super receptive to it when I started talking to her about it. And then and Diane came in, and her contributions were so invaluable. I feel like she and I come at psychology from two differing perspectives that are quite complementary to one another. And I'm so grateful that she was involved. And then Tiffany brought the kind of Chinese medicine layer in, which is something that, again, it's just kind of mind blowing just to understand how, like, that whole perspective of mental health. And so I saw it as a potential, just a little space to fill in the yoga medicine kind of catalog of training. And oftentimes, I think, we aren't training individuals to be therapists. And that's something that we say over and over and over again in the mental health training. It's about training our teachers to be informed consumers, and to use that information and that training to help support their communities in whatever way that is. And that can be something as simple as how you set up a room when you do a group class that can be accommodating and accessible to a wide variety of individuals that are coming in off the street, for example, or from their lives with who knows what kind of challenges that they're dealing with behind the scenes. And how can we create a space that feels supportive for everyone? And then how can we create spaces and practices when we're working with clients one-on-one, when they're struggling with something more specific? How can we try to work with them and find an area where you feel as a teacher comfortable kind of supporting that student?
Yeah,
right? And understanding how sometimes a low back pain might be correlated with depression or anxiety or lack of feelings of support or whatever it might be, and just kind of understanding the landscape kind of from this whole person perspective, I think is really valuable. And Diane brings this idea of like the fit circle and kind of understanding all of the various things that an individual has going on in their lives, and how we don't need to target everything. As a yoga teacher, we can help them work with just one thing, but since all these things are correlated to one another, it can really have, kind of significant positive impact on the student. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I mean, you're coming back to that, looking at all those environmental influences of epigenetics and how it's pretty much impossible to just separate out one and not have that impact the others. It's almost impossible to introduce a movement practice that doesn't influence your nutrition or your capacity to handle stress. So totally. And that was my experience of taking the training, going in thinking, I don't really work with people who are anxious or depressed. Mental health is definitely not my area of expertise. But my goodness, I was stunned when I started working with people one-on-one, how much time they wanted to talk. And I'd be sitting there thinking, we could be working glute med right now. We could be working on your TVA, but you want to talk? So, okay, I'll listen. And it was really not until doing the training that I realized that people are more than just now I knew that people were more than just a hip injury, more than just a complaint of back pain, but you can't unmesh the physical from the mental, can you? They're completely connected. And often the way in is physical, often the way in is mental and emotional. So just broadening the toolkit that you have to draw from. Yeah.
Yes. I definitely like that idea. It's like one thing in the toolkit that you know, our yoga medicine teachers can draw on, because coming back to this idea that humans are complicated. Humans are messy, and that
People
messy
are surprising,
doesn't mean
is what I
bad.
say.
It's just, we all have our own story, and each story is unique. There might be some similarities, but working with humans is
constantly surprising.
Constantly surprising.
It really is.
And interesting.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we have the mental health and wellness module open for registration from the 1st of November. But for people who, a full 55-hour training isn't what they're looking for right now, I would also recommend some of your lectures on yoga medicine online. So you've done a bunch sharing little snippets of science and psychology for people, including one on mental health in general, the health benefits of gratitude, neurotransmitters and yoga. We did a Q&A on stress as a source for positive adaptations, not negative adaptations. So there are lots of ways for those of you who are listening that you can tap in and learn. But I also want to mention on Yoga Medicine Online, your burnout series, your burnout class series. And I'm pretty sure we volunteered you to do that. I don't even think that came from you. I think it was the rest of us teachers going, yeah, well, she's managing a serious career in academia with a relationship and kids and teaching for yoga medicine and teaching yoga in her local area. I think Valerie probably understands burnout as much as anyone. So talk a little about the burnout series. I know the classes are nice and short and sweet, so it's not one more massive thing to add in a life that already feels too full.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I think I was volunteered for it, but I also think it was probably appropriate. And it is an ongoing series in that there will kind of occasionally be classes that are added here and there. And so the idea behind the burnout series is that, just as Rachel said, like the classes themselves are very short, meant to give you kind of just exactly what you need for a short period of time. You don't have to carve out an hour to practice. Some of them are like a restorative pose, seriously, just one pose, and maybe some breath work. And then as an individual kind of works with that series or feels that they might be able to take on more, or they're feeling more energized, because with burnout, we're completely tapped out typically. Our stress response is toast, our cortisol response is toast. And sometimes it's hard to get motivated. It's hard to kind of find that mental clarity. There's aspects of feelings of lethargy and kind of depressed mood and all of these things. And so the idea of making a decision about anything feels completely overwhelming. So hence the idea of short, sweet classes. You can fit them in to a busy schedule, or if you just don't feel like doing anything, but you are trying to support yourself. And then with the intention that if you are feeling better one day, or as you kind of are working through your own feelings of burnout, that you could maybe pair two classes together and do maybe a little bit of movement and then end with a restorative pose or some breath work. And so they're meant to be these little bite-sized bits of practice. They range from restorative to real kind of slow foam movement to breath work, to meditation, and just meant to support somebody who's struggling with burnout or chronic stress. You don't have to kind of meet the definition of burnout to practice them. It can be anyone who just is feeling like they're kind of overwhelmed and chronically overloaded, which there have definitely been times in the last few years where I have certainly felt like that. And so that series was important for me to create. And also it's been really nice to get the feedback from some of our online practitioners saying that it's been really useful, or they recommended it to their partner who was struggling with burnout, just to get their partner kind of moving, or kind of trying to support their partner. And so it's the feedback has been really positive, and I'm really grateful and appreciative for that.
I love that. And I can completely relate to even a very tiny practice, even just one pose, having the capacity to change two things. Firstly, to shift your immediate physiological state. Your breath might soften and slow a little bit. You might relax some of the tension around your face or your neck or your jaw or your hands or your stomach, and just feel better in the moment. But there's also this compounding effect of the feeling of having done something productive, having done something that's taking you in a positive direction, as opposed to life just continuing to happen to you. And that to me really brings us back full circle to that interaction between the individual and the environment, and how you can't separate out environmental factors from each other, because we are complicated beings moving through complicated environments with constant interactions going on between them. So maybe to wrap up, are there any kind of takeaways that you want to leave people with, either when it comes to the impact of epigenetics and our capacity to influence how our genes are expressed through our behaviors, through the choices that we make, or mental health in general? Big sweeping question to finish it up.
I know, big sweeping question. I think that we've mentioned this in some way, shape, or form at various points throughout our time together today. And I think that if there's one thing or a handful of things that individuals can take away is that, our environment, our context is important, that your biology provides a foundation, but for many of the things that we're interested in terms of mental health in particular, it's not destiny, that we have the capacity to change our perception and affect the way that we kind of interact with the world and perceive, like experience stress, perceive stress. And just as you said a moment ago, that all of these things are there, we think of them as separate things because as humans, we like to categorize things and put things in this very black and white space. That helps us make sense of the world, which is fine. But in reality, they are correlated with one another. There's a relationship there, that the relationship we have with our partner is potentially affecting other aspects of our lives. Our work environment might be affecting. There's these spillover effects, and so, but we don't need to work on everything all at once. That we can focus on one thing, and sometimes that is significant and good enough. There's a lot of resources on the Yoga Medicine page, and I think about the monthly dose of mental health, the mental health monthly dose that I did, which is all about resilience, really. And that one in particular, Tiffany let me go a little bit extra in terms of recommending classes that focused on these 3 areas that have been shown to help us increase our resilience and boost our resilience. And, so I think that if there's one thing, if you want to take away, go to that mental health monthly dose and just scroll around in there. There are practices, there are tips and things along those lines to help boost resilience. And, I think that's a positive thing. You can always use a little bit more resilience.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think this topic is so important to discuss in the yoga context, because as soon as you start talking about any of those environmental factors, diet, movement, connection, perception of stress, I immediately think of ways that yoga can help, whether that is through the physical movement practice, whether that is through its influence on the autonomic nervous system and kind of calming down the stress response. I know myself, when I have practiced, I always feel more in myself, and that makes me much more capable of connecting to others, as opposed to just kind of bumper carring my way through life, there's a softening of the edges. You know what I mean? That kind of lets people in.
I do. I feel like you should have done that summary. That was a beautiful summary. I
The
think that you
bumper
could have.
car through life.
I liked that bumper car, but I liked how you kind of brought it all back to yoga and this wonderful practice, which has brought us all, brings us here to this podcast and connected the two of us. It's how we met. And I'm so grateful for that. And, this is a practice that is so important in my own life and so important for managing my own stress and mental health. And I think that that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to find a way to share that through the module and things along those lines.
I think there are lots of things that we do as yoga students and yoga teachers that make sense in terms of how we feel, but it's also really nice to have a structure to them, to have an external kind of reasoning for, oh, that's why that changes things. That's why that feels so much better. That's why it was so important to spend 25 minutes listening to my students instead of making them work gluteus medius. Oh, it all makes sense now. So we will link to a bunch of resources in the show notes. I think this has been a really nice kind of introductory conversation to send people off into lots of different rabbit holes. So we will link to your teaching page on yoga medicine and yoga medicine online. We'll link to the mental health lecture. I'll link to the Yoga Digest article because I think that's a really nice intro for those of you who want to wrap your heads around the idea of epigenetics. And
I'm going to send some links for the exercise bits for anybody that wants to go down that rabbit hole.
Fantastic. So if there's any other way that people are looking to connect with you, where would you send them? Where's the best place for them to find out more about you and what you do?
Instagram is always a good place. I'm more active on Instagram than I'm on Facebook, but you could find me on Facebook as well. And I'm also on Twitter and all under my own name. So we'll link to them in the show fancy notes. Handles.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your passion and love for all things genetics, psychology, yoga, connection. You're a sweetie, and I really appreciate, I shouldn't say that to a PhD, should I? Thank you for sharing the weight of your intelligence with us today.
Oh, geez.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our yoga medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.